Renewed interest has been shed on South Korea's semiconductors and their potential role in strengthening the country's diplomatic leverage. We have more on this edition of Press Perspective. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Wednesday, March 5th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Today we take a look at the link between semiconductors and their role in supporting national security and diplomatic interests. For more on this, I have freelance journalist Yang Chien-Hao from Taiwan, based here in Seoul in the studio. Chien-Hao, welcome back. It's been a while.
Yeah, hello, and very good to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Right. I also have Professor Ramon Pacheco Pardo at King's College London joining this talk virtually. Professor Pacheco Pardo, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Right, Professor, we'll start with you. Let's begin with details of an opinion piece for the American news publication Foreign Policy that you recently wrote, in which you assert that South Korea has more leverage over China than we may think. Could you start by sharing your stance with us, Professor?
Yeah, sure. And that piece basically reflects on the fact, from my perspective, that often South Korea is portrayed as being economically dependent on China, and therefore it is not possible for South Korea to have an independent foreign policy towards its neighbor. And as I said, from my perspective, I don't think this is the case. I think South Korea has several assets that it can use in its relationship with China, such as advanced semiconductors and other products as well. And therefore, South Korea can have a more independent foreign policy towards China than is often assumed. I should say that this article came out of many years of interviews, discussions with South Korean policymakers, experts, business people, also discussions with Chinese counterparts in the US as well. So it is not only based on my opinion, it's also based on my research for a number of years.
Right, good to know. So you link Korea's leverage over China to Korea's semiconductor industry. Professor, a recent survey by a Korean government-affiliated research institute shows experts here in the country, in Korea, ranking Korea second to China in terms of chip performance and related technology. Now, industry insiders here in the country are linking this reality to perhaps a lack of government support for the semiconductor industry as compared to the strong support offered to Chinese companies by their government. What are your takeaways from this latest findings?
I've seen that survey. I've also followed the criticism of the survey. There seems to be a very lively debate in South Korea, which I think is natural. I do think that over time, it is undeniable that Chinese capabilities, not only semiconductors, but other sectors as well. We could add robotics, for example. The shipping industry are getting better and better. That's undeniable, I think. But I do think that South Korea still maintains an advantage, and we see this because of the record number of exports, an amount of exports of South Korean chips and other products in recent years, and including in recent weeks as well. So I think that foreign buyers wouldn't be acquiring South Korean technology unless they thought it is competitive. That's how the market works, as we all know. So I do think that even though it's true that Chinese capabilities will continue to improve, I don't think that countries such as South Korea, Taiwan as well, Japan as well, in certain technologies are going to continue to maintain their advantage. And I would add to this that there is also the politics that we shouldn't forget. At this point in time, it is becoming more and more difficult for China to export its high-tech products to countries such as the US or to Europe as well, because restrictions and tariffs are being imposed on China. And I think South Korea is actually going to benefit from these restrictions. And I think we can see this during the Biden administration, for example, in which South Korean exports to the US increased. I'm talking about high-tech sectors here, while Chinese exports to the US, and it has to be said also to Europe, were flat or even declined because of the politics of the relationship with China.
Right, and before we delve any further into that, Chien-Hao, first, could you very briefly tell us a bit more about the results of that survey on semiconductors?
Yes, this report is published by the Korea Institute of Science and Technology Evaluation and Planning, KISTEP. They conducted the surveys to 39 domestic experts on the semiconductor field in 2022 and 2024. And the very interesting part is they have asked the opinions from these 39 experts among 5 technical categories, including high intensity and resistance-based memory technology, and high performance, low power consumpting AI semiconductor, and power semiconductor, sensor technology, and advanced semiconductor packaging, these 5 fields. So they asked those experts, which do they think that Korea is leading and which part like China is leading. And 2 years ago, according to the survey, Korea was leading in 3 categories, but this time China has taken all of these 5 categories. That is to say, those experts in Korea are thinking that South Korea is trailing behind China in all fields of chip producing, which is a warning signal. Also, this survey has indicated that the key factors affecting South Korea's level of technology will be the human capital flight and policy based on protectionism in U.S. and the rivalry between U.S. and China. Also, facing the growing power of China and Southeastern Asian countries and the tariff and sanctions from the United States and the low investing scale on R&D in South Korea, these factors indeed make the outlook very gloomy.
Right, and staying with semiconductors, but going beyond borders, Chien-Hao, one question. Taiwanese chipmaker TSMC recently, well, Monday night that is, in U.S. time, announced an additional $100 billion investment in the U.S. To boost its output there. Could you tell us a bit more about this particular development and its implications, of course?
Yeah, during the U.S. presidential election last year, we have once talked about that President Trump had said once like Taiwan stole America's chip industry, and he even claimed that the United States should impose 100% tariff on Taiwanese chips. And I believe that last weekend, everybody was watching the argument between President Trump and Vice President Vance and Ukrainian President Zelensky in White House. But this time, you can see that the Wei Jiaqi, the CEO of TSMC, stand in the middle, announcing the investing plan. And President Trump was standing next to him, calling him a legend, and described TSMC as the most important and powerful company in the world. And so the scene was totally different from last weekend. And so you can really see that President Trump is very like businessman style. He want to make deals, he want to bargain, and if you want to seek the help from the United States, then you need to prepare something to trade with him. It is kind of rude and realistic, and it's very different from the previous U.S. presidents. But somehow, again, realistically, I'm glad that Taiwan really has something to trade. Many people think that it's TSMC itself pledging loyalty to President Trump, and TSMC will give up the advanced manufacturing process. But indeed, the advanced manufacturing process is still in Taiwan, and nothing changed. And most of TSMC's clients are in the United States. Of course, we need to pay something to exchange, especially the protection from the United States, and avoid negative factors. Sacrifice does exist, but at least it's not that risky comparing to deal with China. And we say investing, also producing the chips in the United States will definitely increase the cost because everything in the States is more expensive. But since TSMC's production capacity outside Taiwan is only around 6 to 7%. It is estimated that the investment will trigger a 1.5 to 2% decrease on its gross margin, which is not a very big deal to TSMC itself, and it is able to exchange to avoid tariff imposed on them. And the interesting part is after the announcement, a journalist asked President Trump that could this minimize the impact of the United States with chips, and should China decide to isolate Taiwan or China decide to take Taiwan? And President Trump replied that it would have a big impact if something would happen with Taiwan. And comparing to President Biden, who had claimed again and again that to protect Taiwan if being invaded by China, President Trump, he hasn't clearly stated his position till now. But after making this deal, I think even if he still refused to declare it, Taiwan would have cards to be able to bargain with the United States.
Right. Staying with what Chien-Hao has just said then, Professor Pacheco Pardo, speaking within your capacity as a scholar, how does the Trump administration's support of Taiwan in the event of any Chinese hostility look to shape out, given this latest pledge of investment by TSMC into the American market?
I think that President Trump and his administration has made clear that East Asia is different from Europe. President Trump expects Europe to defend itself against a Russian aggression, a potential future Russian aggression like the one on Ukraine, for example. But I think when it comes to East Asia, and I have to say, I just came back from a trip to the US in which this issue was discussed. Taiwan, Korea, Japan, clearly these are three countries that the US wants to work with. In the area of economics, as we have just heard, in the area of technology, but also in the area of security, because from a US perspective, its biggest challenger is China. From a military perspective, from an economic perspective, from a political perspective as well, because of its different political system. And the US is going to focus on working together with partners and allies in the whole of East Asia to try to deter China and, if possible, to win its competition with China. So I wasn't particularly surprised to see the reception that Taiwanese business people, South Korean business people last week received in the United States. The United States wants investment from these countries, and in return, I think it is willing to work with them in the area of security. I mean, I do agree that this is a very transactional approach to alliances, but we have seen in Europe how the transactional approach can backfire for the partner, because Europe now, and Ukraine in particular, are seeing very clearly that the support from the US that they expected is not necessarily there anymore. And from my perspective, East Asian countries are considered differently from the US because of the assets that they bring to the table, military assets, economic assets, and technologies as well.
Right. Professor Pacheco Pardo, you mentioned Ukraine and the US and the fallout that Chien-Hao mentioned earlier that took place at the White House last Friday. With that in mind, there are pundits here in South Korea who have voiced concern about the future of South Korea's foreign policy, as they point out the Trump administration risks reducing the bilateral alliance to a simple business transaction as it seeks some form of economic return in exchange for security guarantees. Do you suppose this new U.S. Stance will drive South Korea to seek new partnerships? And if that is the case, which partners might South Korea turn to?
I think it will, because we already saw during the first Trump administration, South Korea strengthening its ties with countries such as Australia, for example, European countries as well, NATO as well, Canada. And I think during this second Trump administration, I think we're going to see a strengthening of these relationships, plus the one with Japan, including the trilateral relationship. It should be said that recently the Munich Security Conference, we saw a very strong trilateral statement being issued by South Korea, Japan, and the United States, very similar to a statement that the Biden administration could have issued. So I expect this trilateral cooperation to continue, to South Korea to continue to work with Japan. And I do think, as I said, that the NATO, the European Union, European countries, Canada, Australia are going to be strong partners. We have also seen in recent years South Korea strengthening its ties with countries in Southeast Asia, Philippines, for example, Vietnam as well, Indonesia, another of the countries in Southeast Asia that has strengthened its economic and security ties with South Korea. So I would expect this diversification of security partnerships to continue. And more quietly, I think we should expect more exchanges between South Korea and Taiwan as well, that we know have been taking place for a period of time. South Korea has not been as willing to publicize this, but I think they will continue. Having said that, I don't think that South Korea or East Asian countries in general will be treated in the same way as Ukraine. As I mentioned before, the way the US sees East Asian partners and allies is different from the way it perceives its alliances in Europe. So we will have some rocky times, I think, in the US-South Korea alliance, but I don't think we'll get to the extent of poor relations that we see right now between Ukraine and the United States.
Right. Meanwhile, Chien-Hao, neighboring China this week began its annual Two Sessions gathering, a week-long major political event that pundits believe offers a glimpse into the priorities of the Chinese leadership. Could you tell us a bit more about this major event and its relevance this particular year?
Yeah, in Mandarin we call it Liang Hui, which means two councils or two meeting sessions, including the National People's Congress, so-called NPC, and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, the CPPCC. These two councils hold their annual meetings in March. The NPC is kind of like parliament or legislative institution, and it has the power reviewing the government's plans, policies, and budgets, but mostly it's just like rubber stamp. And the CPPCC is another very special institution which the Chinese Communist Party tries to use it to show that there are indeed diverse voices and opinions from the party itself and outside the party. The members of CPPCC will discuss and give their advices to the government, but it is non-binding, which means it doesn't have coercive power. And these two sessions have begun yesterday. As you know, that they don't play that constructive role like the parliaments of in democratic countries, but there are indeed some parts worthy to follow. The premier will deliver the report on the work of the government, which will be helpful for us to know the major direction what the Chinese government want to do in the future. And the major part this year will be the economy. This morning, Chinese Premier Li Qiang has announced that the government has settled the GDP growth target to 5%. And meanwhile, the fiscal deficit ratio is planned to be around 4%. We know that China's economy has been severely impacted by the pandemic and is still facing long-term stagnation after the pandemic till now. And the state-run media outlets, when you're watching them, they're always promoting that it is doing very well and they are optimistic. But if you heard people who have recently traveled to China, most of them they will tell you that indeed that the stores are closed and many companies went bankrupt, even in big cities such as Beijing and Shanghai. And many people are seeking job opportunities. And the country is now also facing the sluggish housing market. And domestic economy is not doing well, and now China itself is confronting another big challenge outside because President Trump has imposed another 10% tariff on Chinese merchandise, which will have very negative impact on Chinese exports, causing more severe economic problems. So if China want to maintain the economic growth or even try to revitalize the economy, it will need to expand the fiscal spending. The ideal way is to issuing bonds to ensure they can obtain much more money to do so. But the problem is that many provinces in China and many regional governments have already incurred a record high level of debts. And many economic and financial experts have pointed out that the debt to GDP ratio of many provinces in China might have very likely exceed 200 to 300%. The scale had been too large with no any good result come out, and now the central government will not only need to deal with it, but also need to gain more money to rebuild the economy, to reboost the economy, which will be extremely difficult. And to fix it, I think the constructive economic reform might be necessary.
Right, and despite those challenges, like you mentioned, the country China has placed its economic target rate for this year at 5% then. Professor Pacheco Pardo, as the Trump administration steps back from the international stage, do you see China stepping up to take on some of these roles?
I think that China will try to do so, certainly, but I do think that we should be cautious because there are many countries that are wary of being caught in this US-China competition. And it has to be said, there are many countries that are wary of Chinese investment. and also Chinese pressure. We have seen countries in South Asia, Southeast Asia, or Latin America, for example, that think that too much Chinese investment can lead to a debt trap, or can lead to their own countries not being sufficiently developed. This is a common criticism that you hear in Latin America, for example, as well. And while it is true that we see the US under Trump putting much more pressure on neighbors, Canada, Mexico, so not only on countries such as China, but we see at the same time that other countries also feel pressure by China to take a stance on issues such as relations between China and Taiwan, for example, South China Sea. So I do think that, yes, China will actually try to play a more prominent role at the global level. And here in Europe, we see, for example, China reaching out to European countries individually and telling them quietly, you know, that you don't have the backing of the US anymore, maybe you should work more closely with China. But you see this wariness that comes from many years of a Chinese policy that many countries dislike. Then you also have, for example, the wolf warrior diplomacy. Chinese diplomats openly criticizing their host countries. We have seen this in Europe, for example, in countries such as France, and this hasn't been forgotten. So it makes it difficult, I think, for other countries to accept China taking the role that it seems the US is going to leave right now under the Trump administration.
Right. And back here on the regional front, Chien-Hao, what are the prospects of perhaps more constructive ties among the three East Asian countries, that is South Korea, Japan and China, amid the more protectionist foreign policy of the US?
Well, we still need to see, but we might have two possibilities. One is that Eastern Asian countries might strengthen the ties to deal with the United States. And another scenario, I believe it will be more likely to happen, is that there will be more chaos and conflicts emerging, since these countries, Japan, China, and South Korea, they all have different stakes, especially dealing with China. Also, variables exist, especially in South Korea, because it is now having a caretaker government after the martial law crisis happened in the end of last year. And we are now waiting for the final judgment of the impeachment of President Yoon from the Constitutional Court. Everything is unstable. And if President Yoon being impeached, then the new election will need to be held. There might be a party rotation. And if Lee Jae-myung from the Democratic Party wins the election, I believe the new regime in South Korea will shift its diplomatic route, seeking more ties and cooperations with China, and might take more stronger stance toward Japan, and that will also trigger United States taking new actions. Things have been already unstable, and it will be very likely become more complicated.
Right, so there is a bit of uncertainty for the near future then. All right, Chien-Hao, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Professor Pacheco Pardo over in London, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Right, well, that brings us to the end of this edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching. Do join us again same time tomorrow.